Hey guys, Jim here, and it's time for Earthquakes. This build is capable of all tier 4 content, and up to at least tier 115 pits. It's relatively easy to gear, and really fun to play. Let's get right into it. So for the skill tree, we're going to start off with Bash, and we're going to take Enhanced Bash without any of the following nodes. We move down to our core skills, we're taking Hammer of the Ancients, with Furious Hammer of the Ancients. Then we're going to pick up 3 into Warpath. Then in our defensive skills, we're taking 3 into Imposing Presence, and 3 into Martial Vigor. 1 into Rallying Cry, going with Strategic Rallying Cry, and 3 into Belligerence. Then in our brawling skills, we're going to be taking 1 into Warcry, going for Power Warcry, 3 into Booming Voice, 3 into Guttural Yell, 5 into Leap, and going for Power Leap. Then we're also going to pick up 3 into Aggressive Resistance, and 1 into Battle Fervor. Then in our Weapon Mastery skills, we're going to take 3 into Pit Fighter, No Mercy, and Slaying Strike, 1 into Thick Skin, and 3 into Counter-Offensive. Then in our ultimate skills, we're taking 5 into Call of the Ancients with the corresponding nodes, 3 into Heavy Handed, and 3 into Heavy Hitter. Then lastly, for our key passive, we'll be taking Unconstrained. Now onto the Paragon Board. So for our Paragon Board, the starting board is going to be having the Wrath Glyph in it, so skills that critically strike generate 3 Fury, and we get an increase in critical strike damage multiplier as the legendary bonus, as well as some critical strike damage from the actual nodes. Our second board is going to be Decimator, so each time we make an enemy vulnerable, our damage is increased by 20% for 5 seconds, overpowering a vulnerable enemy grants an additional 20% for 5 seconds. As for the glyph, we're going to be using Territorial for that damage to close enemies, and the legendary bonus is an increase to vulnerable targets. We also get damage reduction against close enemies, 10%. For our third board, we're going to be going to the left for Force of Nature, so our Earthquakes have 75% chance to spawn a Dust Devil every second that deals damage, and Earthquake damage is increased by 40% of your damage versus close bonus, up to a maximum of 200%. And that's why we have some damage to close enemies tempered into our gear. For the glyph, we're going to be using Challenger. That gives us a boost to all normal nodes within range, and we deal 10% increased damage to elites, and additional increased damage to elites as the legendary bonus. For our fourth board, we're going to the right, and we're going to be picking up the Blood Rage board, so killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant Berserking for 5 seconds, and our damage is increased by 10% of our damage while Berserking bonus, up to a maximum of 45%. Our glyph is going to be Rumble, so with every 5 strength purchase within range, our Earthquakes deal increased damage. We also deal 10% increased damage to bosses and crowd controlled enemies for each active Earthquake, up to 50%. As for the legendary bonus, it's just a increase in Earthquake damage multiplier. And for our fifth board, all the way to the left, you can swap the positions if you want to make it easier, so have your fourth board on the left side and then go all the way to the right for the fifth board, but the fifth board is going to be Weapons Master. So swapping weapons grants you 8% of your maximum fury, and you deal 30% increased damage to injured and healthy enemies. The glyph, we're going to be using Ire, so that gives us a damage to close enemies bonus as the legendary bonus, and while berserking we take 10% reduced damage from elites, and for every 5 strength purchase within range we get an increased damage while berserking. Really straightforward here, and if you want to see the whole board and everything else in it, just make sure you check out the build planner in the description below. Next up we have the Mercenaries. Our hired mercenary is going to be Subo, and we're going to take Wire Trap, Ready at Hand, Cover Fire, and Opening Fire. For our reinforcement, we're taking Rehear, and we're going to use Crater. This will help pull enemies in and do some stunning, and we're going to attach that to our Call of the Ancients. Next up we have our Expertise, and we're going to be using the two-handed mace expertise, so up to a 10% chance to gain 5 Fury when hitting an enemy, double the amount of Fury gained while berserking, and that is a lucky hit. Also, you deal 15% increased critical strike damage while berserking. Alternatively, you could use the two-handed axe expertise. I just realized mine wasn't maxed out, but that gives you a 10% increased damage to vulnerable enemies at rank 10. And the additional bonus is you get 10% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable enemies. If you liked the video, consider hitting all those buttons, you know the ones. So for the gear, we're going to start with the Helm. We're going with the ugly Bastard Helm, and I know we're not using Wrath of the Berserker, but we're basically using this for the bottom part. As you can see, while berserking, your direct damage dealt is converted into fire, and you deal 80 to 100% multiplicative increased fire damage, and that's what we're using it for. As you can see, all of our armor is going to have rubies in it for that extra strength, grand rubies if possible of course. And for the masterworking here, we're going to be going for aggressive resistance, as we don't really need prolific fury, don't really need Wrath of the Berserker cooldown reduction, and we also don't really need the lucky hit fire damage, although it's nice to have. For the chest piece, we're using the Mantle of Mountain's Fury, and as you can see, this is a really good item. You've got chance for Earthquake to deal double damage, which is the main attraction here. We want to get that masterwork all the way up. The unique passive is also very interesting. Hammer of Ancients also forms a seismic line that deals its damage and slows enemies hit by 60 to 80% for 4 seconds. Earthquakes that passes through explode for their total damage and are consumed. So really good way to do damage here and pop things very quickly. For the gloves, we're just going to be using some standard gloves here. We're going to be going for something with strength, critical strike chance, and maximum life. Alternatively, you could go for Hammer of the Ancient ranks. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the critical strike chance, and for the tempering, damage to close enemies, and earthquake size. For our aspect, we're going to be using Vehement Brawler, so casting an ultimate skill increases your damage by 10 to 30% for 8 seconds, and you gain 2 additional ultimate skill ranks. Alternatively, you could use Fists of Fate, and you want to prioritize the critical strike chance for the masterworking, just like the standard gloves. Next we have the pants. We're going to be using Ariat's Bearing here, another really good item. And as you can see, they give maximum life, ultimate damage, resist all, and Call of the Ancients cooldown reduction. For the masterworking, you want to get it on the resistance to all elements. Unless it is a greater affix, then it's not necessary, and you can go ahead and masterwork the Call of the Ancients cooldown reduction. As you can see, for the unique passive, all our Ancients are empowered, so Call It creates an earthquake, Talik leaves Dust Devils behind, and Mador ignites the earth, burning enemies for fire damage. For the boots, we're going to be using normal boots here, with strength, maximum life or movement speed, and ranks into brawling skills, and that's what we want to masterwork. Tempering, we're going with leaf cooldown reduction and earthquake size. As for the aspect, we're going to be using concussive strikes here, so damaging an enemy has up to a 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds. We also deal 5 to 25% increased damage to these dazed enemies. Now onto the weapons. For our first two-handed weapon, our bludgeoning, we're going to be looking for something with strength, maximum life, and vulnerable damage. As for the tempering, we're going to temper it with damage to close enemies, and ranks into heavy hitter, and that's what you want to masterwork. For the aspect, we're going to be using incendiary fissures, so our earthquakes deal 80 to 120% increased damage, and the damage is converted into fire. Now we're going to use our first rune word here, Pugilistic Tectonic Rancor, which is Yule and Tech. So whenever we cast a skill with a cooldown, we'll invoke the Barbarian's Earthquake ability. So really good synergy there with that rune word. For our one-handed weapons, we're going to be using swords, and we're going to look for strength, maximum life, and vulnerable damage. We're going to temper these with ranks into heavy hitter, and damage while berserking. As a side note, if you have damage to berserking on your two-handed weapon here, then you would use damage to close enemies on one of your one-handed weapons. As long as your damage versus close bonus is enough to get your current bonus to maximum, which is 200% in your Force of Nature board, then you could use the rest in damage to berserking. For our first sword, we're going to be using Executioners as the aspect, so our overpowers spawn an earthquake every 4 seconds that deals physical damage over 4 seconds, and your earthquake damage is also increased by 15% for every 100 strength you have. This is why it's very important to try and stack as much strength as possible. And for our second sword, we're going to be using Inner Calm, so we deal 5 to 13% increased damage, triple this bonus after standing still for 3 seconds. As you can see, I have damage while berserking on both of my one-handed swords, but like I said, you could do damage to close enemies on one of them and switch up your two-hand to damage while berserking. And for the gems on our swords, we're using sapphires. For our secondary two-handed weapon, we're going to be going for a polearm here for the built-in vulnerable damage, with the exact same stats, strength, maximum life and vulnerable damage, and we're going to temper this with damage to close enemies, and chance for earthquakes to cast twice, which we're going to try and masterwork to the max. For the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of earthquakes, and although we don't have ground stomp, we're going to be using this for the second bonus here, your earthquakes deal 40 to 120% increased damage. As for the runes, we're going to be using Igni and Gar, so it stores 25 offering every 0.3 seconds, and we cast the non-basic skill to gain the stored offering, and that gives us critical strike chance for 5 seconds, stacking up to 25%. Next up we have the Amulet. We're going to be using something with strength, ranks into heavy-handed, and ranks into counter-offensive if you can get it. As for the tempering, we're going with leap cooldown reduction, or brawling skill cooldown reduction, and for the other tempering, damage while Warcry is active, or earthquake size. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the strength percent. And as for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of Bull Kathos, so leap creates an earthquake that deals physical damage over 4 seconds, and while standing in an earthquake, and for 4 seconds afterwards, you gain 30% increased damage reduction. Your earthquakes also deal 30 to 90% increased damage. And as for the socket, we're going to put in the occult gem Hungering Void, so while we have an aura active, every 8 seconds we pull in nearby enemies. Next up for the rings, we're going to be using normal rings here, going for strength, maximum life, and critical strike chance if possible for both of them. And for the tempering, brawling skill cooldown reduction, and damage while Warcry is active. And for the masterworking, we're going to be going for the brawling skill cooldown reduction, just to help to get your leap under that 7-second mark. And then for the aspects, we're going to be using giant strides on our first ring, so this reduces the cooldown of leap by 1.3 to 3.5 seconds per enemy hit, up to a maximum of 7 seconds. Hitting a boss with leap provides the maximum reduction. This becomes a relatively important breakpoint, as if you can get your leap cooldown to under 7.15-ish seconds, then you can permanently hold down leap, provided you're hitting a boss or the appropriate number of enemies to get the 7 seconds of leap from your giant strides aspect. This in turn gives you easy earthquake generation thanks to the aspect of Bull Kathos. And the aspect on our second ring is going to be Bold Chieftains, so whenever we cast a shout skill, its active cooldown is reduced by 10 to 30% per nearby enemy, up to a maximum of 70%. And as for the two sockets, we're going to be using Moonlight Ward, so for each rank in your equipped unique witch power, you gain 3% damage reduction and 0.5% maximum resistance to all elements. And we're also going to be using Friend of the Bog, so while we have 3 or more growth and decay witch powers, we gain 8% primary core stat, 10% maximum life, and unhindered. And that brings us to our witch powers. So for our unique witch power, we're going to be using Pranado. This is going to be helpful in pulling enemies towards us, clumping them up for our earthquakes. Alternatively, if you're pushing higher tier pits, you would use the cycle. Next up, we have our normal witch powers. We're going to be using Soul Harvest, Hex of Whispers, and Aura of Siphoning. And this will be our 3 growth and decay powers for our Friend of the Bog. And for our last 2, we're going to be using Aura Specialization and Shaken Soul. That's it for the witch powers. Now onto some general gameplay stuff. For the general gameplay rotation, what you want to do is leap into a group of monsters, bash your target to activate Belligerent, pop your shouts and Call of Ancients, and continue to spam out leap whenever possible. Bash if necessary, if there's nothing else for you to do, to reset Belligerent, gain Fortify, and use Hammer of Ancients to detonate your many earthquakes for quick explosive damage. If a group is diminishing in numbers, leap onto the next pack to keep the earthquake chain going and repeat the process. If your cooldown for leap is such that you can hold it down, then your rotation will look slightly different. You'll leap 3 or 4 times, then use Hammer of the Ancients, while keeping your shouts and Call of the Ancients up whenever you can. Line them up for detonation if possible for big damage. Also, if this is the case, you don't need to use your basic skill at all on your action bar, so go into your skills, you can remove Belligerence and take Challenging Shout with Enhanced Challenging Shout. And you can put that extra point into Warcry for some more damage. So that pretty much wraps it up for this build. If you enjoyed it or you made it this far through the video, please hit that like button, hit the notification bell, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below if you want to. I really appreciate it and it helps out the channel a lot. If you're thinking about making a Spiritborn this season, check out this video. Bye!